What would drive a mother to take up arms against the most powerful empire the world had ever known? What could possess someone to rally tens of thousands of warriors against legions that had conquered most of the known world? In 60 CE, one woman dared to do exactly that, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she brought the Roman Empire to its knees. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing how far around the world these ancient stories travel, connecting us across continents and centuries. To understand why this woman's rebellion shook Rome to its core, we need to step back into the world of first-century Britain. The year is 43 CE. Emperor Claudius has just launched the most ambitious invasion in Roman history since Julius Caesar's campaigns a century earlier. For legions, nearly 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers have crossed the treacherous waters of the English Channel. But this isn't just conquest for conquest's sake. Rome has a system, a carefully orchestrated machine of expansion that has worked from Spain to Syria. First come the legions, crushing organized resistance with disciplined brutality. Then come the administrators, the tax collectors, the engineers who build roads and aqueducts. Finally come the merchants and settlers, weaving conquered peoples into Rome's economic web. The Celtic tribes of Britain had watched this pattern unfold across Gaul, modern-day France, just decades earlier. They knew what Roman civilization meant: tribute, taxes, and the slow erosion of their ancient ways. Some tribal leaders chose accommodation, becoming client kings who ruled at Rome's pleasure. Others prepared for war. For 17 years after Claudius's invasion, this uneasy balance held. Roman legions secured the lowlands while Celtic tribes in Wales and Scotland continued their resistance. In between lay a patchwork of allied kingdoms, native rulers who had bent the knee to Rome in exchange for keeping their thrones. It was a delicate arrangement, dependent entirely on Roman restraint and respect for their agreements. But Rome was never known for restraint when it came to wealth and power. And in the fertile lands of eastern Britain, one kingdom would soon discover just how fragile their bargain with the empire really was. Her name was Boudica, though the Romans would later spell it Boadicea, and she was queen of the Iceni, a powerful Celtic tribe that controlled much of what we now call Norfolk and Suffolk. The historical sources that survive are frustratingly sparse about her early life, written as they were by Roman historians who saw her primarily as an enemy to be defeated rather than a person to be understood. What we do know comes mainly from two sources: the historian Tacitus, writing some 50 years after the events, and Cassius Dio, writing over a century later. Both were Romans, and both viewed her through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. But between their accounts, we can piece together the outline of a remarkable woman. Boudica was tall for her time. Cassius Dio describes her as very tall in stature, with a most terrifying appearance. She had, he tells us, a mass of bright red hair that fell to her hips, a harsh voice, and a fierce expression. She wore a multicolored tunic and a thick cloak fastened with a brooch. Around her neck was a large golden necklace, a symbol of her royal status that would have been visible from a considerable distance. But these physical descriptions tell us more about Roman stereotypes of barbarian queens than they do about the real woman. What matters more is the world she inhabited and ruled. The Iceni were not some primitive, backward tribe. They were sophisticated metalworkers who produced some of the finest gold and silver jewelry in Iron Age Europe. They minted their own coins, traded across the Celtic world, and maintained complex political relationships with neighboring tribes. Their territory was rich in grain, metals, and timber, wealth that Rome coveted. Boudica's husband was King Pursudagus, one of those client rulers who had chosen accommodation with Rome. For nearly 2 decades, this arrangement worked. The Iceni maintained their independence, their customs, their way of life, while acknowledging Roman supremacy and paying tribute to the empire. Pursudagus seems to have genuinely believed he could have it both ways: keep his people's freedom while avoiding the devastation that befell tribes that resisted Rome. In his will, he tried to secure this balance for future generations by naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his own daughters, hoping this would guarantee Roman protection for his family and his kingdom. It was a fatally naive calculation. When Pursudagus died in 59 or 60 CE, Roman officials saw an opportunity rather than an obligation. Instead of honoring the king's will, they moved swiftly to transform the Iceni kingdom into a Roman province. What followed was a masterclass in colonial brutality that would have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Tacitus, our primary source for these events, describes what happened with unusual bluntness for a Roman historian. His kingdom was plundered by centurions, his house by slaves, as if they were the spoils of war. The Romans treated the death of their client king not as the loss of an ally, but as a convenient excuse to seize everything they could. But the personal humiliation went even further. When Boudica protested the seizure of her family's property, she was publicly flogged, a punishment that was not just physically brutal, but designed to destroy her authority and dignity as a queen. Her daughters, Tacitus tells us, were sexually assaulted by Roman soldiers. In a society where a ruler's power rested on personal honor and the ability to protect family and followers, these acts were not just crimes, they were declarations of war. The Romans had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that Boudica, like other conquered queens, would submit quietly to Roman authority. They failed to understand that by attacking not just her property but her person and her family, they had created something far more dangerous than a dispossessed royal. They had created a symbol of resistance that could unite tribes across southern Britain. News of the humiliation spread quickly through the Celtic world. Other tribes had their own grievances against Rome. The Trinovants, whose capital at Cameojinum had been turned into a Roman colony, had watched Roman veterans seize their best farmland. Sacred groves had been cut down, ancient temples destroyed or converted to Roman gods. Heavy taxes funded Roman projects, while native Britons were reduced to the status of subjects in their own land. What made Boudica's situation unique was not just the brutality she had suffered, but her ability to articulate a response that spoke to shared Celtic values of honor, freedom, and resistance to foreign domination. According to Cassius Dio, she called upon Andraste, a British goddess of victory, asking for divine support in what she framed as a righteous war against oppression. The spark had been struck. Now it remained to be seen whether it would kindle a flame that could burn down Roman rule in Britain. What happened next reveals Boudica's true genius as a political and military leader. Within months of her humiliation, she had forged a coalition that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The Iceni, the Trinovants, and numerous smaller tribes set aside generations of rivalry and blood feuds to unite under her leadership. This was no small achievement. Celtic society was intensely tribal, with complex hierarchies of loyalty that rarely extended beyond immediate kinship groups. For Boudica to convince warriors who had been enemies to fight together required extraordinary charisma and political skill. She had to offer not just revenge against Rome, but a vision of what British independence could look like. The ancient sources give us glimpses of how she accomplished this. Cassius Dio records a speech he attributes to her, likely his own invention, but probably reflecting the kind of arguments she actually made. She spoke of freedom versus slavery, of dying honorably rather than living in subjugation, of the gods who favored the just cause over imperial tyranny. More importantly, she offered immediate, tangible benefits. Roman colonies and settlements had accumulated vast wealth: gold, silver, fine goods imported from across the empire. Celtic warriors who joined her cause would share in the plunder of their oppressors. It was a compelling combination: moral righteousness and material reward. The military strategy she pursued reveals sophisticated understanding of both Roman strengths and weaknesses. She knew she could not meet Roman legions in open battle. Celtic warriors, for all their courage, lacked the discipline and equipment to stand against professional soldiers in formation. Instead, she would strike at Rome's most vulnerable assets: the unfortified settlements and colonies where Roman civilians lived in luxury, protected only by their assumption of imperial invincibility. Her first target was chosen with devastating precision: Cameojinum, modern-day Colchester, the first Roman capital in Britain. The city was symbolic as much as strategic. It housed a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, the very embodiment of Roman domination. Destroying it would send a message that the gods themselves favored British resistance. But Cameojinum was also practically vulnerable. The Roman veterans who had settled there had grown complacent over 2 decades of peace. They had not bothered to build proper fortifications, confident that Roman arms would always protect them. They were about to learn how quickly imperial confidence could turn to imperial catastrophe. Before we continue with Boudica's campaign, it's worth pausing to consider our sources and what they tell us about how Romans understood this extraordinary woman. The fact that we know her story at all is remarkable. Most Celtic leaders who opposed Rome vanished from history, remembered only as footnotes in lists of conquered enemies. That Boudica became a figure worthy of detailed historical treatment by writers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio suggests she achieved something that genuinely shocked the Roman world. But we must read their accounts carefully, understanding the cultural lenses through which they viewed her. Tacitus, writing in his Annals and Agricola, had complex motivations. His father-in-law, Agricola, had served in Britain during Boudica's revolt as a young officer, giving Tacitus access to eyewitness accounts. But Tacitus was also writing during the reign of Trajan, when criticism of earlier emperors could be politically useful. Portraying Boudica as a noble enemy reflected well on Roman courage, while implying that Nero's administration had bungled provincial policy. The speech Tacitus puts in Boudica's mouth before her final battle reveals as much about Roman anxieties as British motivations. She calls Romans effeminate, addicted to luxury, dependent on baths and banquets, while Britons are hardened by poverty and struggle. This reflects Roman fears about their own decadence, concerns that would echo through the empire's later centuries. Cassius Dio, writing even later, presents Boudica as almost supernatural, a terrifying goddess of war whose very appearance struck fear into Roman hearts. His physical description, with its emphasis on her towering height, wild hair, and piercing gaze, reads more like a description of a Celtic deity than a human woman. This mythologizing tendency tells us that by Dio's time, Boudica had already become a figure of legend. Both authors struggle with a fundamental contradiction. How could a barbarian woman, from their perspective an inferior being in every way, have come so close to destroying Roman rule in Britain? Their solution is to present her as exceptional, almost inhuman in her fury and capabilities. This allows them to acknowledge her achievements while maintaining their assumptions about Roman superiority. What we're left with is a portrait that's part history, part myth, and entirely shaped by the perspectives of her enemies. The real Boudica, her thoughts, her fears, her hopes for her people, remains tantalizingly out of reach. If you're enjoying this journey into ancient history, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're just getting to the most dramatic part of Boudica's story, and there are so many more tales of resistance, power, and forgotten heroes waiting to be told on this channel. The attack on Cameojinum was swift and merciless. Boudica's forces, now numbering in the tens of thousands, descended on the unsuspecting city like a natural disaster. The Roman veterans and their families had no warning, no time to prepare defenses, no hope of escape. Tacitus describes the destruction in stark terms. The city was stormed and sacked, its inhabitants massacred. The Temple of Claudius, where the survivors had taken refuge, held out for 2 days before falling. No prisoners were taken. This was not conquest in the Roman style, with its careful calculations of profit and administrative efficiency. This was vengeance, pure and terrible. Archaeological evidence confirms the literary accounts. Excavations at Colchester have revealed a thick layer of burned debris from this period. Buildings destroyed so thoroughly that the city would take generations to recover. Hordes of coins and jewelry buried hastily during the attack tell stories of families who fled with whatever they could carry, hoping to return when the danger passed. Most never got the chance. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction. For 2 decades, Roman colonists had lived in Britain with the casual confidence of conquerors. The idea that British barbarians could threaten their safety was literally unthinkable. Now that assumption lay in ashes. News of Cameojinum's fall spread panic throughout Roman Britain. Londinium, modern London, was still a young city, barely 20 years old, but already a thriving commercial center. Merchants, bankers, and traders who had grown rich on British resources suddenly found themselves in mortal danger. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, was campaigning in distant Wales when word reached him of the rebellion. He faced an agonizing choice: continue his own campaign against the Druids of Anglesey, or race back to save Roman civilians. The decision he made would define the rest of the conflict. Meanwhile, Boudica pressed her advantage. Her next target was Londinium itself. The city had no walls, no garrison worthy of the name, and no possibility of effective resistance. Like Cameojinum, it had grown prosperous in the shadow of Roman protection. Now that protection was revealed as an illusion, and the city's wealth made it an irresistible target for Boudica's ever-growing army. Governor Suetonius Paulinus arrived at Londinium to find a city in chaos. Merchants were loading whatever they could carry onto carts and ships, desperately trying to escape before Boudica's army arrived. The governor faced a harsh reality. He had perhaps 10,000 soldiers immediately available, while intelligence suggested the British Queen commanded over 100,000 warriors. The decision Paulinus made was as cold as it was rational. According to Tacitus, he was not deterred by the wails and tears of those who begged for help, but chose to save the province by the sacrifice of a single town. He would evacuate his troops and abandon Londinium to its fate, preserving his forces for a battle he could actually win. What followed was perhaps the most complete destruction of a Roman settlement in British history. Boudica's forces swept through Londinium like wildfire, killing everyone who remained. The archaeological record again confirms the literary sources. A thick band of burned clay and debris marks the complete destruction of the early city. Recent excavations have even uncovered evidence suggesting the rebels systematically targeted Roman symbols. Statues were smashed, official buildings torn down stone by stone. From Londinium, the rebel army moved north to Verulamium, modern St. Albans, which suffered the same fate. In the space of weeks, 3 of Roman Britain's most important settlements had been obliterated. Contemporary estimates put the death toll at 70,000 Romans and British collaborators. But success carried the seeds of its own destruction. Boudica's army had grown enormous, but it was also unwieldy. Tens of thousands of warriors were accompanied by their families, their cattle, their household goods. A vast moving city that could devastate undefended settlements, but would struggle against disciplined troops in favorable terrain. Paulinus, meanwhile, had used the time bought by his strategic retreats to concentrate his forces and choose his battlefield. Somewhere in the Midlands, the exact location remains debated. He drew up his legions in a narrow valley where British numbers would count for less than Roman discipline and equipment. When the armies finally met, Boudica gave one final speech to her warriors. Tacitus imagines her standing in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, calling on her people to choose freedom or death. It was a moment that would echo through British history for 2 millennia. The last great stand of independent Celtic Britain against the inexorable advance of Roman civilization. The final battle was a masterpiece of Roman military engineering. Paulinus positioned his legions at the narrow end of a valley, protecting his flanks with dense forest, and ensuring the British could not use their numerical advantage. When Boudica's warriors charged, they met a wall of Roman shields, spears, and disciplined brutality that had conquered most of the known world. The slaughter was complete. Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons died while Roman losses numbered in the hundreds. Boudica herself did not survive, though whether she died in battle or by poison to avoid capture remains unclear. Her daughters disappear from history entirely, their fates unknown and unrecorded. The Roman response to the rebellion was swift and merciless. Paulinus launched a campaign of systematic devastation, burning villages, destroying crops, and executing anyone suspected of supporting the rebellion. It was collective punishment on a massive scale, designed to ensure that no British tribe would ever again dare to challenge Roman authority. Yet the very severity of Rome's response suggests how deeply Boudica's rebellion had shaken imperial confidence. The Emperor Nero seriously considered abandoning Britain entirely, viewing the province as too costly and dangerous to maintain. Only the intervention of his advisors, who argued that withdrawal would encourage rebellions elsewhere in the empire, kept Roman legions on British soil. Over time, Roman policy in Britain became more accommodating. The brutal exploitation that had triggered Boudica's revolt was replaced by a more subtle system of cultural assimilation. British elites were encouraged to adopt Roman customs, Roman education, Roman ways of life. The next generation of British leaders would be Roman in everything but blood. But Boudica herself lived on in ways the Romans could never have anticipated. Her story survived in Celtic oral tradition, passed down through generations as a symbol of resistance against foreign oppression. When British writers of later centuries looked for heroes to inspire their own struggles for independence, they found in her a figure who had dared to dream of freedom when freedom seemed impossible. The woman who had challenged Rome became something Rome could never defeat. An idea, a symbol, a reminder that even the mightiest empires rest on the consent of the governed. Her legacy would outlast the empire that destroyed her, inspiring rebels and revolutionaries across the centuries who saw in her example the eternal truth that no people need accept domination forever. What can we learn from Boudica's story today? Perhaps that leadership in times of crisis requires not just courage, but the ability to unite disparate groups around a common cause. Perhaps that the powerful ignore the grievances of the powerless at their peril. Or perhaps simply that some stands are worth taking regardless of the odds, because the alternative, a life without dignity or self-determination, is worse than death itself. What do you think? Was Boudica a hero fighting for freedom, or a war leader whose rebellion brought unnecessary suffering to her people? How do we balance her achievements as a unifying figure against the ultimate failure of her cause? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing different perspectives on these ancient stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman Britain, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories from history. Next week, we'll be exploring another figure who dared to defy empire, but that's a story for another time. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that history is never as simple as it first appears.